Pompeii is a byword for destruction and tragedy, but there was much more to it. A good example are the beautiful gardens there. But what were they used for? What was grown? What did they look like? And how comparable are they to the gardens and green spaces of today? Join me and a guest as we discuss the gardens of Pompeii on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi, my name is Neil, and in this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Venner to guide us through the gardens. Jessica is an AHRC M3C funded doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, studying classics, ancient history, and archaeology. Her thesis is on the subject of subsistence and commercial food cultivation in the urban gardens of Pompeii. Jessica previously undertook an MA in Classical Civilizations at Birkbeck, part of the University of London, and is an editor of the Gardens of the Roman Empire online appendices, a follow-up to the print version published in 2018. Recently, Jess was on the team responsible for mapping all gardens in Pompeii. She previously held a professional post at the British School at Rome in London and currently volunteers at the Chiltern Open Air Museum, the Ashmolean Museum, and Waddesdon Manor in Aylesbury. Jessica, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking all things gardens.
Excellent. Yeah, it's, I think, particularly valid at this time of year. People, I think, in the recent period, have become a bit more associated with green spaces. It could be a balcony, it could be a garden, it could be a local park. So I think this has got a particular relevance because people are finding the green spaces around them a bit more. The
Mhm.
subject is quite niche, fantastic, very interesting, but niche. How did you end up getting involved in it?
It's quite a roundabout story. I actually began by studying a BA in magazine publishing and loved it. But about 2 years in, I said to my mum, I don't really want to do this anymore. And she made me finish, which I'm grateful for now. Um, but the reason was that I'd been reading a couple of books that really caught my attention. One of them was The First Ladies of Rome by Annalise Friesenbruck.
Yeah.
And then I read The Empress of Rome about Livia by Matthew Denison.
All right.
They're such good books to start with anyway. But what really caught my attention was the women behind the men.
Mm,
And you always hear about the emperors, always on
yeah.
TV programs, on podcasts, everything. And it's, of course, very interesting, but these are the stories that we're familiar with. So
Mm,
I was just caught by that. I thought that's amazing. So I I went to do an MA at Birkbeck, at Classical Civilization, as you said, and I focused on local produce of cultivation of food at Pompeii in regions 1 and 2. And there are 9 regions, so I just focused on 2 there, and just thought it was the best thing ever. I was going to focus on art, and I didn't, and I'm so grateful. Um, so then I went to do my marketing career and all sorts, and ended up at the British School at Rome, and then applied for a PhD, and they gave me a scholarship. So that was great.
brilliant.
So yeah, and AHRC and M3C are just so supportive. So yeah, they're brilliant. But more broadly, it's an area that's focused on by only a small group of scholars is Roman gardens. So
Mm,
um, market gardens in particular are never really looked at. So the whole area began with an archaeologist called Wilhelmina Jastrzębski in about the 1950s, and she sat down with her. She just published a book. She sat down with her husband in the garden one day and said, "What do I do next?" And he said, "Well, you like Roman gardens, and you like gardens, and you like Romans. So why don't you do that?" And she did, and she started this whole area that no one had ever really looked at before. Began excavating in Pompeii and found this, this mass of gardens, so market gardens, recreational gardens, all sorts of vineyards, orchards, you name it, it was there. And no one had really looked at these open spaces before. And when I started reading about hers, I thought, I mean, this is incredible. We can really learn about the Romans properly through their gardens. I think we all have an attachment, like you say,
yeah,
to gardens
definitely.
anyway. So yes, that's the in a nutshell. That's how I'm here.
What I find particularly interesting about that is it's a relatively new discipline. It's something
Mm.
new, and as you said, it's something that gives such an insight, because you were talking earlier about how we often view Rome through a particular lens. For example, you were
Mm.
talking about how the women in Rome aren't always accentuated in terms of understood,
Yeah.
perhaps researched on their own merits. And that's very true. I think that that has changed slightly. There have been some more books. I think The First Ladies of Rome, I've read that book as well.
Yes.
Absolutely
Good
excellent.
book. Yes.
There's a book I think I recently read by Agrippina, Emma Southern, and
Mhm.
that's excellent as well. And
Mm.
it's just this idea of revisiting and trying to find a new way of understanding Rome and the gardens. When you think about it, it makes absolute sense. Why
Mm.
weren't we? We're always crying out for a view in antiquity, be it ancient Greece or Rome, of what the common everyday experience was of people. And I
Yes.
think the gardens are just that. So it's in a way quite surprising, but I'm very happy that it has been something that people are looking into. And I imagine it will be something that grows, no pun intended, and becomes really quite a weighty subject in itself.
Definitely. Yes. And a couple of recent projects hopefully are going to do that. You mentioned that I'm an editor on the online appendices. So it's called The Gardens of the Roman Empire. It's a follow up to the print publication that was produced by Jashemski and scholars. And unfortunately, she died before it was published, but they carried it on. And now we're continuing that. And you can go online. It's in its beta phase at the moment, but later on, you'll be able to see all of the gardens, hopefully, of the Roman Empire and just have a little browse around. So, very, very exciting.
That gives me a bit of a neat segue, because I saw that you tweeted that recently, and I
Mm,
shared that on the Ancient Rome subreddit of Reddit, and it went down really well. People were really interested in that, and
that's
so
great.
there is definitely an appetite. And actually, to that point,
Hmm.
if people want to learn about what you're doing and the work that you're doing, Jessica, where can they find that?
So, my Twitter is Miss JL Venner, Venner. Um, and the website that I was just talking about is roman-gardens.github.io. And I put all of my most recent publications about Roman gardens on academia. So you could just search my name on academia and
Yeah, I
you'll
found
be
your name
there.
a couple of times when I
Ah.
was doing some research.
Good, that's good. Doing something right. But yes, I'm there and I'm always happy to answer questions. So yes.
I'm going to put these down in the episode notes. In case you weren't aware, I've got a website. It's at ancientblogger.com. And I've been putting episode notes up for each of my podcasts recently to give people who've listened to them a bit more info, because you talk about a lot of different things. And that's
Hmm.
great to talk about, but sometimes you need to see things.
Yeah,
And in this particular podcast, I'm going to be putting a lot of images up, because there's some fantastic things that we can see, diagrams of the gardens, the art in the gardens, remains, everything. So I'll be putting those in there. And obviously, Jessica, I'll be putting the links that you've mentioned in there as well. So if you need to find them, you can also find them there.
great.
When we talk about gardens, you mentioned kitchen gardens and market gardens. What were the types of gardens that were there that you've looked into?
So I generally like to look at it into two categories, which I'm sure I'll go over, but it's not generally that simple, but for understanding them, you have the recreational garden and you have the commercial garden. So the recreational garden is the ones that you see in Renaissance reproductions. So you've got your topiary, you've got geometric lines, paths, water fountains. You'll have some garden frescoes to make everything look a little bit bigger. Trompe l'oeil.
Yeah.
Um, always that good word. Um, and yeah, so that's the sort of the beautiful gardens. They were very, very careful about how they designed them to get a certain message across. And then on the commercial side, these are the gardens that were owned by people or rented out, or they would use slaves, unfortunately, to cultivate these gardens. They were most often found outside of the town, but in Pompeii, we have lots of evidence for them being inside the town as well. And these gardens, you'll be able to identify them by furrows, by very neat lines of root cavities that we can excavate in the Vesuvian area now. Um, and of course, irrigation methods. There's all sorts of things, tools. But yes, there's a very, very stark difference. But generally,
Okay.
they were always very, very ordered, which we're not surprised about the Romans, I suppose.
So what we're looking at, I suppose, then is you've got your recreational private, and then you've
Hmm.
got ones where you'd actually be growing a surplus of whatever you're trying to grow.
Exactly.
You mentioned a percentage of green spaces, that is to
Mm.
say, what we've spoken about in Pompeii. Can you remind me, what was that percentage again?
So it's been estimated that there is 33% of Pompeii was green.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. It is a lot, and we're still excavating too, so there's going to be more.
Yeah, you've kind of talked yourself into a lot of work there, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Can't wait, actually. I can't wait. But yes, I'm sure you know. But with Pompeii, we're sort of archaeologists are preserving a lot of Pompeii for future generations, so that we have the
Mhm.
technology to preserve it properly instead of just excavating as we go to be greedy. So that's,
Yeah,
and obviously funding. But yes, there are gardens emerging, which is so exciting.
and there'll be
So
more to be
yeah,
found,
yes, more to be found.
because
Yes.
people don't realize that much of Pompeii still hasn't been excavated.
Exactly. Yes.
And
So
yes,
that
there's
is
still lots,
exciting.
but I'm
Mhm.
always hoping that somewhere they'll manage to find a box and it's got a whole bunch of plays in there, or
Yeah.
you
Yes.
finally got a section of works. I've always wanted, sort of Claudius's history of, I think it's the Etruscans. Bit
Mhm.
niche. I think most people have got
Really?
theirs. Perhaps it's not the most popular one to wish for,
No.
but that sort of thing. So hopefully, perhaps we'll find something else, and we'll find more about the gardens. So let's start then with the gardens. I think what I'd like to do is purely, I've got a balcony, so I don't get to grow anything. So I think perhaps
Uh-huh.
starting with the sort of private
Mhm.
recreational gardens, where were those found exactly?
So traditionally, and I'll use Pompeii as an example, you'd find these at the rear of the house. So when they were built along the same sort of design. You'd have the atrium at the start. So if you're walking through the house, you start from the street, you can see through, you see the atrium, you walk through that. You might go through the master's, what I like to think of as the study, the tablinum, and you walk through that again. And you might end up in a peristyle garden, and that was,
Okay.
as we the ones that we see in films, actually. So you've got the columns, and then you've got the
Yeah.
beautiful design of gardens in the middle, maybe a fountain, and then you could, if you were that rich, you could have another garden at the back,
Oh, so it's
or
like an extra garden.
yes, exactly, or you would just have the garden. So yeah, the peristyle was like a very wealthy thing to have, but that would be
Right.
a garden in itself. But the rear garden you'd use for growing, you know.
Oh, okay. So you might have, yeah, sort of kitchen garden, because I've seen reference
Exactly.
to those where they sort of fall between the two. You're growing produce, but you're not growing produce necessarily to sell. You're growing it purely to supplement what you would cook and what the house would consume.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
Just to outline a couple of terms, in case people aren't overly
Hmm.
familiar, I'm going to put, as I said, I'll be putting up some diagrams on the show notes to show what these are. The atrium was a sort of courtyard within the house.
Hmm.
Most Roman homes, it's difficult because there are different types of Roman homes. You might have an insulae, and these were very small apartments, sort of what we might say one room flats. We're assuming that there's no gardens in those. Gardens, private gardens, would have been for those who could afford a larger house, and a larger Roman house was effectively a walled enclosure with a suite of rooms inside, and the
Hmm.
atrium was a courtyard. So you wouldn't have a roof there. You've probably seen it. I dare say, if you've ever watched HBO's Rome, you would have seen an atrium. They often have sort of little ponds in the middle. They're brilliant ideas. Functionally, they let a lot more light into the place. They could regulate temperature. They look good, and the atrium was that space. The When we talk about peristyles, what we're effectively, as you said, it's a sort of covered area, usually colonnades. So you've got columns and these are areas underneath. So these are very often would come to where you would find the artwork, because you haven't got exposed walls. So just to clarify, you wouldn't have a fence. You're not talking about walking through someone's house and having a fence in their back garden. These were walled areas. And the peristyle, again, I'll put an image of one up. You'll recognize it immediately. These were covered areas with columns that would, I presume, afford you a bit more shade, and you can kind of lounge around in them. And then you had the main open space of the garden. Is that generally? I'm assuming that's generally what we see at Pompeii.
Yes, that's generally what we see. Yes, if anything, they would in if you were middle classish, if we can call it
Mhm.
that, you would want a peristyle, and at the
Okay.
very lowest area, you would have almost always have an atrium or some sort of hall,
Yeah.
to receive guests or to show off guests, and then you would want the peristyle, or you'd have a light well, which was just genuine.
Okay.
It's, some of them are less than a meter, but it would just let in light down a well into your house, and you would usually have a painting of a garden on the back to give that impression of, I still have a garden, even if it is tiny,
Right.
you know. So you'd have some element. And you mentioned the pool in the middle of the atrium. That's called, just for listeners, that's the impluvium, and sometimes you would have flowers planted around that as well.
Okay.
So yeah, so there were, and they did have flower pots. We don't know where they put them too much. The Greeks love those, I think, more. But yes, so you had the garden throughout, really, paintings of gardens throughout as well.
What we're talking about then, primarily with these gardens, they're a prestige thing.
Yes,
You're
yes, they
making a
are.
statement, and you're talking about people going, you would show off. So these are kind of statement pieces within the house to display wealth and standing.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes. And the fact that we've got the rear garden, if you made it there, you were definitely a high status, important guest.
Right.
Because,
Oh, okay.
yeah, because the way that the house worked is, it sort of worked in a hierarchy that reflected Roman hierarchy and social situations. So, of course, you'd be in the atrium, and that was considered a more public space. And it's not what we would expect today. You wouldn't just let
Ah,
someone in your porch today, but that's the place to be seen. So Augustus, for example, used to have his wife Livia and others milling around in there, showing off their weaving and what have you, so that he looked like a traditional
yeah.
household. And so you would wait in there for your meeting with your patron, and people would see that. So the more you had, the more important you were. If you
Right.
made it through the rest of the house, so by stages, then what my research has shown is that the garden was definitely a privileged space to end up in, to be viewed in, and they were designed in that way to you limit access to them, and
Wow.
therefore you can let people in when you want.
So what you've got then is not only is the garden being used as a way of showing what your representation of your wealth is, it's also used to kind of basically give your friends or associates a kind of gradation. You mentioned the patron there, and I think that's an important point.
Mm.
uh, People might not be completely aware of the patron client relationship that there was in ancient Rome. And that is to
Mhm.
say, if you were someone of worth, and if you had a garden with a peristyle, as you've said, you would be of worth. You'd have clients, you'd have people who relied on your support, and obviously you got loyalty from them. Imagine I'm in someone of some importance, and
Mhm.
I've been invited, and I get to go past all the other rooms, and I'm out in the garden. What might I see?
Well, we have lots of varied examples, but I will take you to the House of the Ephebe.
Yes.
So the House of the Ephebe was a fairly wealthy property. It was quite a long property. It had a couple of atriums, so that's important in itself. Why would they have two atriums? To limit who's coming in and to show off certain parts of the house and so on and so forth. They also had a garden, and in this garden, it was sort of split into two. So on one side, you had a triclinium, which is a three-couched dining area. And again, this is something we're very familiar with from media. So you would see that, and it was huge. That was surrounded by frescoes. They had a big statue there of a god. They had little items around. I think they had flowing water even in this
Mm.
one. So yes, you'd be asked to sit down on that, again according to your status, depending on what couch you were put on, and sometimes this put some people out of the nose out of joint a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. And then on the left-hand side of the garden, you had an area that was it was split by a path, a little trellis fence with little herms on the top, little heads. And again, there were more garden frescoes found there, which were very beautiful. You could walk down the path, and you could go and sit on the semicircular bench there. There was a little marble table. And what Jashemsky found were little furrows in a little area, um, that were reminiscent of a vegetable garden. So this
Okay.
garden has everything really. It has the showing off bit, the bit where you entertain, and that was looking out. If you sat in the dining room that was inside, you would be looking out onto this beautiful garden. They had a big open area to look at. It's a bit like we have today, an open plan. It was kind of like that, actually. And then you've got your little rustic garden. And my own research has shown that actually this could have supported at least some of the household, perhaps the slaves,
Ah,
but I think more so because of the where it's positioned in relation to the triclinium where you would dine. They wanted you to see that. They
okay.
wanted you to see that they were being traditional, a bit
Yeah.
like we do with, you go and give someone your courgettes from your allotment today.
Yeah, okay. Go
Yeah.
local.
Yes. It was a bit like
Locally
that.
locally sourced.
Yeah, I think they were trying to cling on to there was this big, don't be too luxurious thing
Yeah.
going on, but you have to compete at the same time. It was quite a fine line to walk. But I think this is one of those examples. So yes, we got that. But in terms of what they grew, I mean, it was so, so diverse. There were so many trees that we found in Pompeii, and we know that there was an apple seller who used to go around in the graffiti. Well, the thing that we found saying apples, apples, buy my apples. So we know that there are apples nearby, and that's a good evidence. We also have pine trees, loads of those, cherries, almonds. Oh God, what else do we have? And then, but well, there's loads of those. But then we've got blackberries.
Mm,
Obviously, we have grapes, which I'm sure we'll go into.
yeah.
They loved a fig. They loved
Yeah.
an olive, obviously, as you'd imagine. But they also had lots of herbs. So you have coriander, oregano, rosemary, mint. Um, these are harder to find. We can't
Mm,
find those in the archaeological record because they would have just been obliterated by the eruption.
yeah.
But there are other things. So the root cavities of the trees, for example, we can look at those and identify what was growing there
Okay.
with relative accuracy. I mean, sometimes you're not so sure, but also the frescoes in the gardens and sometimes in
Yes.
the houses are actually really helpful. So
Yeah.
in the house of the fruit orchard, we have this little room, and it is so so beautiful. If you ever go to Pompeii, anyone that's listening, do go to this house. It has this amazing fresco of trees, and they are just fruit trees, and one of them is a citrus. So it makes you think whether we had, this is a big debate anyway
Oh,
among
yes.
archaeologists in Pompeii, but whether they had citrus or not. Some are very adamant that they didn't, and some think they did. So I think it's relatively possible to bring a one over in a pot and give that a go.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah, and I
think
know
so.
it was important to Jewish communities as well, and
Oh,
there are
okay.
some links there in Pompeii, but it's all very, yeah, nobody really knows. But does that give an idea?
That's absolutely brilliant. You've hit a couple upon a couple points there. I just want to start with the house, the ephebe. You have
Yes,
the Tricolinium, which is the
yes,
couches. If you were looking above this, it would look like a horseshoe. So that's
yes,
the way that the couches were laid out. And when I had a look round and obviously did a bit of reading myself, on these couches on the base, I think that's where we find the frescoes of the Nile,
yes,
and
yes.
there's some scenes there of Egypt, of the Nile, some ones with hippopotamuses or hippopotami, lots of them anyway, and all
Yes.
sorts. This was quite a so you can imagine if you're going to eat and you get sat down there, you've got this kind of exotic scene. Now, Egypt was well known to the Romans. It was an incredibly important province, but still the idea of the exotic, and you could have that in your garden. And then you've also just mentioned about the scenes of the orchard, and that's a kind of realism that you
Mm,
have as well. So you have this weird contrast. And I was going through some of the frescoes, and I found it fascinating that you could really use frescoes in a garden to either suggest normalism, as it were, kind of reality, a false reality, or you could go way over and have these really quite fanciful, exaggerated myths. The one that you're speaking about with the fruit trees, just to pile on the intense lemon debate, which, if you didn't know it existed, it exists. There is the debate is whether or not Pompeii had lemons. The earliest, I think, the earliest defined absolute concrete they had lemons in Rome is a pit that was found in the Forum in what was known as the Mamertine prison, and that's been dated to the first century AD or CE. The difficulty is, of course, everything before that. There is pollen that's been found in a core sample taken from a lagoon, an ancient lagoon near Cumae, and that has citrus pollen in there. There's also citrus seeds that have been found in Pompeii. One of the problems is that seeds and pollen don't always indicate what it was, and you've got different types of citrus. The what I've heard or what I've read is suggested that there was definitely citrons, which are kind of, I've never seen one before, and these are big uber lemons.
Hmm.
Um, and then you've also got the lemon as well. So we don't really know whether Rome, or rather Pompeii at that point in time, and leading up to the final days of it, had lemons aplenty. When you cite the fact they had frescoes, sometimes that means they were aiming for realism. Sometimes it could be, well, here's an exotic thing. We don't know if they were necessarily viewed as a kind of exotic, again, like as you said, with the prestige, kind of, if you can have a prestige fruit, perhaps they were prestige fruit. And I'm going to put some of the papers that I found where someone's done incredible work using carbonized lemon seeds, or what they think might be lemon seeds, and they've kind of gone into huge amounts of detail. So
Hmm.
it goes to show, just I found it really interesting. I was going to say it's it was a rabbit hole I really quite enjoyed. I really got
Oh
into it. I was
yes,
like,
this is the thing with gardens and Roman. It's because it's fairly new in terms of the interpretation. I mean, Jastrzębski started in the 50s, and there have been so many good papers and
mm,
books on them. But yes, these sort of things you can never be quite sure, and I think that's kind of the appeal.
yeah, yeah,
So I mentioned the root cavities of
mm,
trees. So, for example, there is a root cavity that Drzemski found, and she thought that it was a citrus tree, and she used to talk to the locals a lot about what they do today, and it's remarkable how similar it is. It is really remarkable, and yes, that citron they still grow there, and they're bizarre. You open them
wow,
up, and it's not what you expect. It's all pith. It's really odd, but anyway, um, yeah, it's very likely that they were growing them. I don't see why not. Whether they were able to acclimatise them, I don't know.
hmm.
They struggled with that with dates. So perhaps they couldn't. There were certain things they couldn't grow, and much to their distaste. But yes, importing they would have.
Yeah, in
Yeah,
one of the houses, they found. Trying to think which one it was. They found, it might be Julius Polybius, perhaps, or
yeah,
was it Veti?
it was
They
there. Yeah.
one of those houses, they found fragments of terracotta in amongst the roots
Hmm.
of some of the trees, and they think that these were originally started in pots and then planted. So
Yes.
that kind of gives, obviously, as you were saying. So these were sort of, I imagine, what people do today when they garden. But just to stay with the private gardens, you've mentioned the kind of privet hedges, that kind of thing. So you'd look, if you looked out, you'd have this rustic perhaps area, because Romans were, if nothing, loved the idea that they were all, oh yes, I wish I could go back to being a farmer again, like my great, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
they loved that. They were nothing like that. And there's a particularly catty thing that I'll come to later. Unsurprisingly, it's Cicero. If you went into these gardens, you would see order, generally speaking, the hedges, the box hedges, like you say. I presume then you'd have grass, you'd have the statues.
Mm.
Am I missing anything else? I'm trying to think of anything. Again, it's difficult to standardize because, as you've said, there are
Yeah.
so many different gardens. They all do
There
things
are.
slightly differently.
It's really helpful, like you're saying here, to compare the literary sources with what we actually have in the archaeology. So there's this lovely passage from Cicero who's referencing his friend's garden, it might be his brother, and he's saying about the how talented the gardener is. He's such a talented gardener, and he's even got ivy going up the statues to make them look like they're alive, like they're coming out
Oh,
of the
wow.
ivy. Um, so they were really, really skilled. I mean, the topiary, Pliny the Younger says about how he's got his name written out in topiary.
Really?
Yeah, this
Oh,
is not
no.
much longer after they're moaning about it, and he's already doing it. So, it's quite something. But they had gardeners that they put a great trust in
Mm,
to sort their gardens out and to show off. And it was really, really important that you got it right. The areas of shade had to be correct so that you could walk. And actually, this is something to comment on. Walking in the garden was so important. You would simply walk up and down, a bit like you see in a Jane Austen film. You
mm.
just walk. You would. meant to be seen walking. And in the public gardens of Rome, that was the idea. You'd walk and you'd wait for an invitation to dinner. It was sort of that,
Right.
or you'd meet some friends or whatever. But they were designed to have straight lines so that you could go up and down around the exotic plants that you've planted and show off those. And yeah, so there was all sorts going on there.
We mentioned some of the frescoes. I just want to talk about some of those because I found them. Again, I'll put images of these up. There's one there's two in the House of the Golden Bracelet. And if you ever
Mm,
wonder why houses are called what they're called, it's very often it's because they're identified through what was found there. If you're a bird lover, you've got to look at these images. There's two frescoes. One of the fresco has a sort of bird bath with a wood pigeon on it, and another one has just all sorts of birds in a sort of similar environment. It's all set against bushes, so it's trying to look real. And you've just got these birds that have been painted on it, and they're absolutely beautiful, and they're so detailed. They can be identified. I got a list. Someone actually went through. I put it on my Instagram, which is Ancient Blogger, unsurprisingly, and someone has actually gone through and identified each bird. So the
mhm,
ones on the north wall, you've got swallows, magpies, thrush, golden oriole, and a turtle dove. On the east wall, you've got a rock dove, flycatcher, chaffinch, thrush, quail, and a purple gallinule, which is walking along the bottom. That's what that is. I'd never heard of one of those before.
no.
And apparently that was seen as quite an exotic bird. So even when they're trying to do realism, there's that sense of, yeah, but in my garden, when I do realism, it's got that sort of waft of the exotic about it. But they're really beautiful. So you've got those kind of frescoes. Then you've got the fresco in the House of Venus. In the House of Venus, you just got this massive Venus lying sideways on a shell. And you
Mhm,
think of as Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Well, this is kind of that, but not obviously as good, and lying sideways. She doesn't look particularly happy. I think Professor Mary Beard has written a book on Pompeii. If you want a book on Pompeii, read that book. It's fantastic. And she makes the comment that Venus really doesn't look at all bothered or particularly nonplussed about it. It's not until you see how big that is, it dominates the wall that it's set against. And you would have seen this from far out.
mm,
There are these absolutely fantastic frescoes. So where you're talking about, you had the gardeners who were considered experts. You can imagine they would have had demand for artists, the latest artist who can
mhm,
come and put a fresco, the most up-to-date fashionable fresco. Perhaps they did, right, we're going to get rid of that one, we want a new one up there for the latest trend because now we want scenes from here, or this kind of
yeah,
myth is really doing the rounds at the moment. So again, a lot of these are kind of concurrent, could be linked into modern attitudes. Nothing seems to have been permanent, as it were. It seems that people were able to kind of shift things around and change things with new fashions, which is a very human thing.
mhm, definitely. And there are actually four styles that have been recognised in Pompeii, and well, we use Pompeii as the start, but four styles of art, and they go from the very, very basic to the absolutely outrageous. So yeah, some of those that you've described are all parts of that development. And a lot of these frescoes also were, it's worth remembering, there was an earthquake in AD 62 that hit the town of
Yeah.
Pompeii and the surrounding area. A lot of the town was destroyed. I
Mm.
mean, a lot of it. And I mean, in the house of Caecilius Secundus, which is one of the ones you learn when you're doing Latin at school, he's that guy in the book. Um, he has, he even has a picture of these statues falling off of their statues because they're wobbling in the earthquake. So that was the earthquake he was referencing. But after that, a lot of the town was rejuvenated and they were trying to rebuild, and they would have been putting up new paintings. And we even have, you know, the remains of lime in certain houses where they're
Mm.
about to start doing the frescoes, which is part of the process of it. You need lime to do that.
Right.
And yeah, so yes, they were changing all the time and you had to keep up. You had to keep up. It was keeping up with Joneses.
Sometimes these frescoes were very, very clever in what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah.
The House of the Veti, you might well recognize it if you've ever seen an image of Priapus. And
Mhm.
Priapus is, I won't say anything more other than he seems happy with his lot. And he's on the outside of the house.
Yeah.
And the fresco is of him by the front door. And again, the point you made earlier about if you stood by the front door, you could see all the way through the house. And Mary Beard, again, Professor Mary Beard makes this point. And in the garden, you would have seen a statue of Priapus. So you would have seen the fresco in the front, right where you're waiting to go in, and then you had a distinct sight line to see that as a represented in as a statue in the
Mm,
garden. So again, it's kind of this matchup. It's very, very, I would say
yeah,
subtle, but it's just very, very clever. It sort of it speaks to a lot of what we would consider like a modern value of matching and making sure things line up. It just says a
yeah,
lot about how people thought about it. Probably my favourite garden though, the private gardens, is the house of Octavius Cortio, and that's because in the garden there is this. I think it's been measured around 50-meter channel that runs the entire length. It kind of cuts the garden in two, and this has trellises over it. It has arches, it has little bridges. It
yeah,
fed fountains. Apparently, it would have had fish in it, and everything set alongside of it matches and mirrors. So it's it's the dominant feature. And the way that you got water in there apparently it was a feat of engineering in itself. But it's just absolutely fascinating. And I put a picture again. I found a couple of really good pictures. Someone even did it in Minecraft. I found someone had done their own version of it in
not
Minecraft,
surprised.
which is just fantastic. But I really like that. And this is funny enough, this became or seems to have become a trend. And I mentioned earlier the kind of catty comment of Cicero. Some of these became nicknamed as Niles. That if you had a Nile in your garden, it's the idea that you had a canal, as it were, because you could be
Yeah,
that ostentatious and afford all of that. And Cicero, on the Laws in Book 2, he's talking with Atticus, and Atticus actually says they're walking around, and of course they're out in the natural landscape, and they sort of sat there, and Atticus is saying, "Oh, I feel sorry for all those people who've got expensive marble and all of these, fancy. This is really what you want." Oh, and they have those silly little canals that they call Euripius.
Euripus, yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
Euripius, or their Niles, and the nickname, all of that. And it's just this real kind of snobbiness that when the Joneses have competed with you, you need to kind of change the rules of the game. So now, oh yeah, uh, I can't believe they would do that because they've kind of outdone you. So what you try and do is then go back to basics. No, no, no. What you need is a basic garden, as you were
yeah.
saying. Here's my rustic garden.
Well, yeah,
Here's yeah, all of that kind of stuff. And it just kind of speaks volumes of that Jones's attitude about that, because it seemed quite popular. But Cicero, I think, in a later one, when he was saying he was talking to his brother Quintus and he was writing letters, he actually starts talking about how he wants one of these canals or water channels in one of his gardens. So he's, not above himself, wanting what everyone else wants to do. So again, it's kind of an insight into the way people
yeah.
were.
I,
But
I
it's
definitely, yeah, it was all about that, and especially at Pompeii, you didn't have a great amount of water, and like the earthquake I
mm,
mentioned recently, the earthquake cut off some water supply, which
right.
wasn't fantastic in Pompeii anyway. So if you were someone like Octavius Cortio, you were especially important, and they had lots of water fountains, so you could
Mm,
go and collect some water, and you could bring it back to your house. I mean, there was some. Tubes put in the walls so that you could feed it through. So you didn't have to walk all the way around with your, your tank of
wow.
water, your bucket of water. You would go and put it through the through the channel, and it would feed around the channel. They were very, very particular about water. So
Mm,
yeah, if you had it to display, that was particularly important. You had running water, and the fountains you could even turn off. So
really?
actually, I think it's in the House of the Ephebe. You could direct where the water was going by turning the tap. So it would go to the left, and you'd irrigate the left, and then you go to the right. It was incredible. They were very, very particular about it all.
They've
Um,
got to have pranked someone on that.
oh, surely
I refuse to
we
believe that
would.
we've
So
got no
yeah,
evidence for it, but I refuse to believe that at some point someone didn't go, "Oh yeah, can you have a look down look down this tube here, look down it. Is there
definitely.
anything blocking it?" Turn on the tap. There we go.
It's so funny. And you also mentioned the fish. So yes,
Yes.
in that Euripus, they had little hidey holes for the fish so that they didn't get too hot in the sun.
Oh, brilliant! So there was that, because I know at this point, let's say first century AD or
Yep,
CE, it's you start to get the idea of people, particularly in Campania, so Cumae and places like that, where people have their own sort of, I would say, fish pools, but they start to become a thing,
they
a
did.
real thing.
Oh yeah,
Particularly
yeah,
when they want to grow eels, or not grow them, but farm
that's
eels
it.
and do things like that. That the fish
Definitely.
become. But I loved. I didn't know that. So they even had. They kind of. everything's got so much detail and attention to it, because you
Yeah.
obviously you don't want dead fish floating around your fountains
Oh God,
or
no,
floating
no.
down there. So you've got somewhere, and I presume as well that would stop them being predated, because you can imagine the people. I know people have problems today with if a heron
Yeah,
or something finds your pond, then adios. But
yes.
here they've got somewhere they can actually, like you say, either
Hide
keep.
away.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the trellis
brilliant.
as well would have shaded it. So yes, they'd have had they had vines going over. We found root cavities near columns and what have you
Right.
in that garden. And you're right, it was all very geometric, very, very organized. So you'd walk around, like I was saying, you'd walk up along that channel and round and then back again. And there were statues along the way to view. So yeah,
You just mentioned, and it's something I'd never even thought of, the shading in the right places, even
yeah.
even controlling the temperature
Oh, really
of what's
important.
people's experience as they walk around. Visually, you're looking at different things. You're perhaps hearing different things because the fountains are on, and then you're cooling down at the right point if you're on a long walk. These private gardens were really about putting yourself on the map socially, explaining to people where they were in a type of
Definitely.
hierarchy,
Yeah.
and and keeping up with the Joneses on a
hmm
massive scale.
And I'm convinced that the owner of the Octavius Cortio house, there's a there's a gate at the back or a door at the back of the garden. So I'm convinced that he used to let people in because you can't get up into the house, which is on a high level,
Mm,
unless you go a very specific way. And we know that slaves used to stand in the way of places you weren't allowed. So I'm convinced that they didn't. They didn't want you to get up there. I feel like sometimes he might have opened it up,
right.
just by the way and the door is positioned right near the amphitheatre. It's a very, very public place.
Oh,
Or at
okay.
least you would be able to see through into his garden, at the very,
Right.
very least. But it was definitely a statement. Yeah.
I think we've covered private gardens pretty
Yes.
well. As I said, it's probably quite good though to start looking at the other types of garden,
Mhm.
the ones where what I've read termed as the market garden, and a market
Mhm.
garden is where you're creating a surplus of something, growing something. I suppose the first question is, these were obviously different. They could exist in some way, sort of as an overlap within private gardens, but where were these found in terms of their location within Pompeii? They
So, the majority of these market gardens were found in regions 1 and 2. So, if you were looking at a map of Pompeii, you've got the amphitheatre in the bottom right-hand corner, and region 1 and 2 surrounds that amphitheatre. Um, there are so many here, and this is where I focus my research because, of course, they're all bundled there. It was sort of seen as I think, a periphery area of the city. So when the Pompeii was built, it was more towards the left-hand corner, if you could call it that. It started there, the Old Stadt, which
okay,
means the old town, and it built out from there. And I think this is sort of considered the agricultural area almost. I mean, if you were walking through it, it'd be very, very green. There'd be trees everywhere, vineyards, all
right,
sorts. So yes, you've got those, but they were at the back of houses, and often they're
okay,
called the house of the ship Europa. But it
yeah,
doesn't mean that that was a house. So these names can be a little bit misleading sometimes.
right, okay,
Yeah. So what it means is that with the House of the Ship Europa, for example, it was a house. It was a wealthy house with an atrium, um, and it was combined with another one next door. And then they built the garden at the back. And I think
right,
they must have demolished quite a few buildings in this block, a bit like in a New York block, an
mm,
insula. And you've got a huge garden. I think it's just about 1,800 square meters. It's a massive, massive garden, and it's across a couple of terraces as well. So it's on a little southern slope, which Columella said you should put your gardens on a southern slope. You'll get the
right.
best out of it. Um, so yes, so you've got those huge ones, and that was a vineyard, an orchard, and it had two vegetable plots.
Okay.
And
So,
then you've got gone.
sorry,
So you
what was when you say it was an orchard? So they had, it wasn't just used for one particular produce. You had
no.
everything there.
Yeah, so you could just have a vineyard, but it was very, very uncommon. And if you go to the area today, that's uncommon as well. You'll often have something else going on there.
Right.
So they could have trained up trees, though you'd have to have a lot of trees. And I think considering it's in a town, that probably wouldn't work. So we think that they were trellised, so they were staked, the
Yeah.
vines, and they would have been in a sort of square sort of shape, a bit like a trellis you'd have today, actually, and that would keep the ground shaded underneath and keep the moisture there. But you could have trees, so they were often around the edges of the garden, and they would be fruit and nut trees most often. And then to introduce nitrogen into the soil, which gives you a better grape, they would put beans in between the vines.
I didn't know that. I knew about the trees because there's some discussion about you could grow vines a number of different ways, and some
Yeah,
you could go from not having anything and just having them on the ground
yes,
through to using trees specifically and
yeah,
then mixing it up. And from what you're saying, it was a bit of a mixture. But I didn't know about the beans. That's really interesting because that's obviously,
yes.
again, they've obviously got quite a developed concept of what you should be growing
Oh,
and how
very.
you get the best produce from it.
Absolutely, and they knew about their grapes as well.
Yeah.
It's not really that different today. So, Columella and Pliny talk about the Horconian, or we think it's maybe Holoconian, after a Pompeian family grape, which was Pliny said was very strong, and it was productive only in fertile soil, which Pompeii, of course, being next to a volcano, was
Yeah,
extremely
absolutely.
fertile. Um, so yes, they had a very good idea of how to rotate crops in farms and all these different techniques. And I mean, some of them have been tested, and some of them we're not quite sure on, and they get very very detailed. One of the very luxurious figures at the time was Pliny said, "Oh, he waters his lettuce with honey to, to make it
Really?
taste nicer." Yeah.
Oh,
So they had all these different, and there's another one that's like what Pliny advises when a dog's weed on your vegetables. So, you've got all these random things that they knew about, and they had all of these different ideas. But yeah, a lot of it is still used today. So, like I said about introducing the nitrogen, they clearly knew
Mm.
how to do that. We have found beans between vine cavities. Um, and yeah, so yeah, very,
There
very
are lots
detailed.
of there are lots and lots of vines and grape varieties. If you go to Pliny, he talks about this
Yeah.
is so many. And what's interesting, I did have one question that was asked:
Mm,
how have species changed? And
mm,
obviously, species in the modern era have changed a lot because you've got crossbreeding, you've got selective crossbreeding, you've got all sorts of agricultural practices going on. But even back in the time of ancient Rome, there were, as you said, there's probably crossbreeding going on or similar things. They
yes.
had an understanding of agriculture, but some things had stopped. I think Pliny talks about a couple of grape species that existed in the time of Cato the Elder. He was writing in the mid second century BCE, and he says they just don't exist anymore. So there's possible through the period
Mm,
of ancient Rome, species or varieties, should I say, of grapes and the like that had just stopped. They weren't
mhm.
grown anymore. So it's not this one consistent. I found reference to a vineyard that was planted in the old cattle market.
Yes, the Foro Boreal. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that was really that's quite massive. I had there was they said 58 trees, and I found this, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's like 58 trees that were located there, and I think they used them as well as trellises, as you've spoken about. They
That's
had
correct, yeah.
winemaking facilities there, and they also had a nearby tavern, and this was next to the amphitheater. So
Mhm.
if you're thinking about growing something and then being able to sell it, you've got everything in one place. It's very
Yes.
self-sufficient.
Yes, they had 1,200 vines there,
Wow.
or up to 4,000 or something mad. It's literally insane. I was having a look yesterday at how much they could have produced, and Jastrzemski says about she sees 4,000 vines. She works out from what Columella advises about how much you could get out per vine, and she thinks about 2,400 gallons of wine.
Wow.
I think that's an easy estimate, maybe. I
So
think
you think it could be more than that then?
potentially. It depends how intensively they were growing, and it seems quite intensive when you look at a
Mm,
full plan of this,
yeah.
of where the cavities were found. Um, but yeah, like we say, they're very, very skilled, and you could get a few writers say, you can get a few harvests out of the
Mm,
land around Campania per year.
yeah.
So who knows? I mean, we'd need to ask we'd need to ask a local vineyard, I
Yeah.
guess. But yeah, ones that I've visited have looked about the same sort of size, and they produce a mass amount. So you've got you mentioned the wine producing, so you've got the Dolia, which are huge terracotta jars almost that you would put in the ground, and then you would grind down your grapes, and then you would put them in there, and then you would harvest them. You would get it out around autumn. You'd put them in
Mm.
there. The harvest was around autumn, so and that's another reason we don't think that the eruption was in August anymore.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
come to that,
yeah,
or mention it. We've not spoken too much, obviously, about the other part of Pompeii, which everyone always talks about. And just as a cheap, and I feel bad already, but what the hell? Plug. I did a podcast episode on it where we go through the events leading up to it, and also the prehistory a bit of Pompeii. But yeah, there is always that has to come with a caveat that we have this traditional date of the 24th of August, AD
mm,
79, as the eruption of Pompeii. There's several arguments that say that actually isn't correct. One of them is that there's been some graffiti found that actually refers to a later date in the year. Other, and perhaps more comprehensive, is the agricultural evidence,
yes.
and these are things that have been found. Would you be able to just describe that in a bit more detail than I did?
Yeah, so I mean, I was always suspicious because there's things
Mm.
like cherries that you wouldn't be. There are certain things, and I mean, they might be importing them, they might be
Yeah,
preserving them. It just didn't sit well with me,
yeah,
and the lids were off of the dahlia and things. Like they were clearly doing something. So sorry, they were on the dahlia, so they were ready to go. So clearly they'd already harvested.
right.
Yeah, and they wouldn't leave the wine long. You wouldn't be. The ones out of the town would be doing the fancy ones, the fancy wines, the Falernian
Oh
that
yeah,
you pay a lot for. But yeah, so those were the little clues. I mean, we've got literally a ton of pomegranates in Oplontis, and there's just
mm,
this. I've seen the pile; it's incredible, of just pomegranates, and that's another little clue there.
mm,
So yeah, it's hard to know though, because of course this was 2,000 years ago. So how can
yeah,
we know exactly when they harvested? But it can't have changed. A bit like you were saying about the species, it can't have changed that much in
no.
2,000 years. So we do have a good idea. Um, yes, and often the locals say we've done it that way always. So,
It's pretty tough. It's pretty tough because if you say the eruption didn't happen on that day, then
mm,
of course the onus is on to say it happened at this date. Until we have something more comprehensive, the current
exactly.
date is as stands, but it does come with that caveat. And we've looked at grapes quite a bit, and as you can imagine, they
Mm,
were pretty popular. I don't think that's much of a surprise. I just want to quickly I tried this out on a friend at work, and I said to them, "What foodstuffs do you think weren't being grown in Pompeii?"
right.
And of course, we came up with some obvious ones. I think potato, that wasn't grown in Pompeii. You wouldn't have had chilies, I don't think. What were the other peppers?
Tomatoes.
Tomatoes. Now, tomatoes was the one that stumped everyone. Tomatoes were not grown in Pompeii because they were one of those foodstuffs that only came over to Europe, I think, from the New Americas, as it were, or
Hmm.
South America, or I think it's South America, perhaps it's North America. Anyway, it didn't come from the European continent, nor did they have access to it. You can correct me, I'm sure you will, on this one. The orange,
Yeah, no, we've not got any evidence
no
for oranges.
oranges. So you think again of things you think of when
Yes,
what
yes.
people were growing when we talk about orchards, because you've mentioned orchards a few times.
Mm,
Straight away in my head, orange trees, lemon trees. Well, we're not going
yeah.
to do the lemon thing again, but perhaps yeah, you might have orange trees, but no. And again, no tomatoes. There was quite a lot of stuff they weren't growing. You've mentioned olives. I think, what other sort of main foodstuffs have you found to be in those gardens or in the market gardens?
Hmm. So a real mix. So it's all fruit and nut trees.
Right.
So like I mentioned, they loved the fig. They love
Yeah,
a
yeah,
fig.
yeah.
And they were everywhere. Um, and yes, obviously we've been over the grapes and all this, but they also had lots of apple trees. So either
Okay.
sorb apple or apple. So there were
Right.
different varieties. um, Obviously not a tree, but they had strawberry, wild
Yeah.
strawberry, which Pliny wasn't a fan of.
I didn't think they'd
Um,
have them for some reason.
no, and they're not what we would look at now. I mean, they're more like wild, and again, they've been depicted on frescoes in the town. But
Hmm.
he calls them arbutus unado because you don't eat it once. So won't go into that further. But
Mm.
yeah, it's not good for your tummy, basically.
Right. Okay.
He didn't like those. Um, and we've got lots of other berries, so like blackberry, mulberry, hackberry. I think these would have been around the orchards as well.
Mm.
But in terms of nuts, so they loved a nut, and they were obviously really good for you. Like they would fill up your diet quite a bit,
Yeah.
fill you up rather. So we had chestnuts and hazelnuts, walnuts. Oh god, loads. Pine nuts. Yeah, those were the main ones.
Mm.
Oh, we had pear as well.
I was going to say
Yes.
pears. Again, when you go through some of Pliny's stuff in natural history, the chapter will be of the 49
Oh
species of
god, yes.
pear and what to do with them. And you're thinking, nah, he's not going to, and he does. And you could
Yes,
just
he
see
does.
he lists
Oh
all
yeah,
of them and talks about them and gives them
right.
nicknames. I think was it the Persian apple? He nicknames one of them
Yeah, yeah, he
as the
does.
Persian
Yes.
apple, and that's not a slight, by the way, because sometimes when people give names to things that aren't from their own area, it's done in a kind of pejorative way. This was because that's what they thought it may have come from. It may have been a Persian thing. Yeah, there's lots of pears. I did
There
see those.
are, yeah, and peaches as well. So
Peaches. Okay.
yeah, I think they were fairly recent. So he talks about one being so much money. I mean, like such a lot of money for just one peach. But I think they were being grown as well. But I can't, off the
Okay.
top of my head, think of any peach pits. I think there are, but
Right.
I don't know. But the others are. What I mean is they're rare. You
Mm,
would, I think mostly they'd be imported.
mm.
But yeah, so we've got pretty much everything that we have today. So
Now, I've read that we had chickpeas, which
yeah,
chickpeas always a funny one because that's what Cicero translates as. That's his
yeah, so
nickname.
very important. They're very important in lentils as well.
Yeah.
So of course, if you were poor, you'd be eating porridge pretty
Mm,
much, so porridgey gruel. You might add a bit of sausage to it, a bit of honey maybe,
mm.
and then you'd go up from there. You'd have chickpeas and lentils to fill you
Yeah.
up, things that are cheap. And these, like I said, these sort of things and beans were grown between stuff. So the
Right. Okay.
intercultivation of different varieties to make the most out of your garden and the most profit possible,
I wonder
basically.
if
So,
that's done today. Again, if you're listening to
mm,
this and you have a garden, you've got so you're growing different things. I'd be interested to hear. Do you mix things in? I don't know if that's. I presume that must be a practice that's done today, but it's not. Again,
yeah.
I don't have a garden to grow things in, but I just wonder
No,
if that's what people will do now.
I think they
I
do in
presume they
the
must do.
area. They
Hmm.
do in the area today in Pompeii still. So it makes sense because you've got not much room to work with. So
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, and also, like you say, if it's helping, it's a kind of symbiotic relationship. It's good for the soil.
correct.
I found that there's lots of different types of millet,
Yep,
lots of
there
different
is.
types of wheat, oat,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I was just trying to look through the other things. Yeah, pretty much it peas as well. I think
Yes,
there was some
yeah.
peas grown.
Yeah, and then so the wheat in particular, they don't seem to have been processing it in the town
No,
at the time that I'm looking at gardens around the first century. It seems to have stopped because they've got so advanced, the Roman Empire, that you're able to do that outside of the town, bring in the
yeah,
grain, and people use it from
yeah,
there. But yeah, in terms of like vegetables, which we've not mentioned, um,
no,
no,
go for it. Go for
Pompeian
vegetables.
Pompeian cabbages or Campanian cabbages, they're really or Herculanean cabbages. They talk about these. They love their cabbages.
Yeah,
Um, and then they've you've got carrots and radish. Um, you've mentioned all the other ones, but turnip, onion, garlic.
yeah,
Garlic in particular. There was a dish called moratum, which you'd make your bread and you'd make this little garlic and herb sort of spread to put on top.
mm,
And that was what the farmers ate because there is a whole poem dedicated to this subject. A farmer getting up in the morning, making his bread, making his garlic spread, and eating it and getting the garlic from his garden. So,
wow.
yeah, they say that it was Virgil, but it was someone that was copying Virgil, I think.
You
Um,
wait, that will be on Instagram soon. That will be a story on Instagram.
I know. They love that. And again, that's what you said earlier, the rustic ideal. If you
Mm.
had this and you could go into your garden, you could get the garlic. I mean, we're doing it all now.
Yeah,
And then,
yeah, that's
yeah,
fair enough.
and the citrus. So we've gone over that one. Oh, cherry. Did I mention
Oh, yeah,
cherry?
yeah, cherries, yeah.
Yeah, cherry was another one that was famous around Pompeii. They produced very good cherries, apparently.
Wow.
So,
And again,
yeah,
cherry, I wouldn't have thought for some reason. I
no.
don't know why, but I can't find any kind of logic to why I think some fruit or veg,
Yes.
obviously, and others, nah. And for some reason, cherry, strawberry, just didn't think that they would be
It's
there.
funny,
But
isn't it? It is funny. Yeah, there's so many different ones, but yeah, like we said, most of them are on frescoes, and you've even got the little pruning marks where they've
yeah,
made sure that they're keeping it back, and also, like you said, there's so many different varieties that wouldn't grow alongside one another or bloom
mm,
rather at the same time. But you do get in frescoes that ideal image of the garden all blooming at one time. Perhaps a commentary on their power and their ability and their technology to look after their gardens to such a careful degree. Um, but yes, these all of these things were growing. You'd have whole gardens dedicated to an olive. There's a little garden that seems to have been created out of the space of a house, a domus, after the earthquake. They seem to have demolished it, made a garden, and it seems to have been an olive nursery. So
all right.
that's lovely. They did have plant nurseries too. So of course we never really. It only occurred to me a couple of years ago that they must have been going somewhere to buy these plants
Yeah.
to put them in their gardens. So a little version of home base or B&Q in Pompeii. Incredible.
I read a thing. Again, I'd like to find
Mm.
the source for this. I haven't got the source for it, but I read reference to cucumbers, I
Yes.
think it was cucumbers, or it was something like a cucumber, and Tiberius loved them. But the problem they had with growing them was obviously they don't like the cold too much, so he had them in little carts on wheels, and they'd be wheeled out during the day, sit in the sun, nice, and then at night wheeled back in,
Yep.
and just to be kept if anyone knows of that, please send me a tweet and just this is where it was noted. I imagine it's probably sounds like something Suetonius would have said, possibly, or
Yeah,
Tacitus.
yeah.
Yeah.
I can't quite think at the moment, but I do know that there's another one. Marshall mentions a cucumber, and he's
Oh.
moaning because he's got too small a garden to grow a cucumber lengthwise in. So he's really not happy because he wants to show off his rustic garden, you see. And this is
Yeah.
something if you were important, you'd have your friends round. They'd see the rustic garden, then you'd eat some stuff from the
Yeah.
rustic garden. And he was fed up because he just had what he was making out was, a window box.
Right. Oh,
So
okay.
he couldn't grow a cucumber lengthwise in it because it was too small. So he wasn't happy about that. I doubt that was
And
true
I'm
though.
just going to go. If you've not read Marshall, some of his stuff is eye watering. It's quite rude. So the irony, I think, could be that Marshall has a cucumber, and is one of the more ruder writers, and yet doesn't make any kind of joke on it.
No,
That's He just missed that one. Perhaps he just thought, you know what, it's just too clean for me. I don't want to do. I don't want to do
maybe,
that. Yeah.
maybe.
It's lazy humor. I'm above this. I'll just write about something really bad I saw in a bath. Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got quite a lot of veg being grown there. I
Mhm.
just want to throw in flowers into the mix
Yes.
because we don't tend to think of flowers as being part of this. And I've read that there were quite a lot of flower gardens as well, or there were flower gardens.
Yes, so the Garden of Hercules
Mm,
is such a lovely idea example. So you've got again the furrows and little raised plant beds where they were cultivating flowers, and
mm,
flowers were really really important to the Romans, not
mm.
only for garlands and religious ceremonies. So this garden, just to give you an idea, was a matter of yards away from the gate that went out to the necropolis, which is where you would bury your
Okay.
dead. It had to be outside of the city. So you would walk into the city and there was this flower garden, pretty much. I imagine that they were selling gardens outside of it, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, but they were also producing perfume in this garden, and perfume was
Right.
really important to the Romans as well. And
Yeah.
much to the distaste of some ancient writers, saying, "Oh,
Yeah. Oh,
it's ridiculous."
naturally.
Yeah,
Naturally.
always the old times were better.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Always. Yeah.
always.
Rustic.
Oh God. But I read somewhere that you could use olive oil in perfume making. So this
Right.
garden would have been using that, and it was just covered in flowers, as far as
Mm.
we know. There were loads and loads of cavities that Jashemski found. She also found lots of little glass bottles for the perfume. So it's all being made on site. And this is one of the ones that had a really complex irrigation system.
Excellent.
So
I'm glad you mentioned
yeah,
irrigation because that is a question that I want to come to. So yeah,
yeah.
please talk about the irrigation here.
So, this is the one that I was mentioning earlier, actually, with the little hole in the wall,
Mm,
and it's incredible. This channel goes up and down the garden, and they use the slope, the natural slope of what I was saying
mm.
earlier, where it goes down to the south. So it would have flowed around the garden, and then whatever was left over would have collected. They would have collected as well in a little jar. So they were really particular, and like I was saying, they were having to go to the fountain for this, the local fountain. It
Yeah.
wasn't something you could just get on tap like you would
No.
now. So imagine how hard it is to raise flowers
Yeah.
today
Yeah.
in Britain, even in when it
Yeah.
gets hot. Comparing that to Italy, the Italy heat, it's just, I don't know how they did it, but it was extremely rigid irrigation systems. And yet they would have little, what we call sombreros around plants, which would store the water. Yes, so they do it today. Again, if you go to Italy today, they still make these little sombreros around the
Really?
plants to keep the water in. Yeah,
Wow.
it's a tried and tested technique, and they're still doing it now. Um, so yeah, they would have those, and also it's worth mentioning that from the volcano, which had erupted many times before Pompeii even existed, pumice. There's pumice in the soil, which naturally stores
Oh, of
water.
course. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was, I don't they would have known this because one of the
No.
writers says, "Ah, there's pumice, so it's fertile and blah blah blah." But yes, so there's lots of different methods, and they would go with their jar, their amphora, which you would
Mm.
reuse from when you had wine in it or what have you, and they'd go and collect the water and they'd come back and they'd do all of that. So yeah, it's very
Was
particular.
it the House of Hercules? They had the
Mhm.
large dolia to catch rainwater. Was it there?
Yes,
I think.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of those, and there's a lot of cisterns as
So you
well.
have like water, well, like you'd have like water butts today. I think it's
Yeah.
worth considering just how good Roman roofs were at collating and
Mm.
managing water. It's something that we don't always think about. If you ever want to read a really good piece on it, there's Alex Scobie who wrote about slums and all sorts, and he talks about the water. If you weren't aware of this, the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer at Rome, wasn't really a sewer as we would think of it. It wasn't really plumbed into the cisterns. It wasn't a case of flushing toilets or anything like that. It was largely used. I mean, the origins of it I go into in one of my podcasts, and that was about it was basically a drainage channel because of the propensity of that area of Rome to flood continually, and so they needed it's kind of like a divergent channel to take the water away. But in the later times, it becomes a great way of getting what is effectively wastewater at street level
Mhm.
off the street. And so if it rains really, really hard, it just flushes the sewer out and it goes out that way. Likewise, when you've got all of these roofs in Pompeii, they would have acted in a similar way. They wouldn't be wasting rainwater. Rainwater would have been guided from them into channels, you say, into pots, into the really quite structured irrigation systems they had. So they were they're very clever. We think of Rome as being managing water through big things, through the big aqueducts and
Mm.
stuff like that. But it could be done at a very, very small level. And you can imagine, as you said, how difficult it was to keep flowers watered in Pompeii. This is one way you made sure that if there was a brief shower, you got as much of that rain stored as you could.
Yeah, and you're completely right, and especially after the earthquake when they were cut off potentially. We don't know
Yeah,
for
of
sure, but
course.
it's likely, isn't it? You've got the Aqua Augustus nearby, which is part of the aqueduct.
Mm,
Augustus gave Pompeii that pretty much. But then if that went, then what do you have? But
yeah.
there is evidence of wells from the original properties potentially that were before, early days of Pompeii, and they seem to have been relying again on that. So there seems to be they start using wells again. So they have all these techniques, and I mean, cisterns are a really good example of where you can find young plants because they needed. So vines, after a while, you don't need to water them so much. If anything, you thirst them out and you get better grapes. But trees, the same. After a couple of years, you don't really need to water them too much. So it's always a good indication when you find a cistern that there are young plants nearby or
Okay,
flowers.
so that was an indicator of the kind of horticulture that was going on nearby. See,
Yes,
again, small details like this can
small
tell us so
details.
much. When they were using, when they were growing and doing what they needed to do, what were the tools that they were using? What sort of things were they using that we probably use today?
Oh yeah, so it was all very similar. So they had spades and
Yeah.
hoes and oh my goodness, shears. Actually, you know what? Anything that we do use today, they were all completely the
Really?
same.
Okay.
Yes, they really, really were. Forks, everything. They haven't changed. They were
Mm,
particular on. There were a lot of pruning forks.
yeah.
Oddly, we find fish hooks in gardens quite a bit. I
Oh,
don't know if that's
I've,
something to do with
ah,
pruning.
I've got something on that.
Oh,
I've
good.
got something on that. When I say I've got something, I don't know. I've got a possible, very tenuous link to this. I
Mhm.
was looking at some of the pest control methods
Oh
that they
yeah.
had, and Cato, for example, mentions use of Amurca. I think that's part of olive juice, and he
Mhm.
says if you use that on vines, you can protect against caterpillars. But one of the things that Pliny suggests to get rid of ants or to make sure ants aren't hanging around in your garden too much, you'd hang a fish in a tree.
Really? I
Yep.
haven't ever seen that one.
He's got. I'll give you
Oh,
some
well,
of
that's
these.
it
Right.
then. The
This
fish hook.
the first one up. Protect grapes. If you rub a pruning knife on a beaver skin every time it was sharpened, for extra protection, you'd also use bear blood on it, and that protected grapes.
As you do.
Hanging, yeah, exactly as you do. You can pretty much do as you do to all of these, and it becomes
Yeah, you
increasingly
can.
weird. Hang a fish in a tree, as we see, that apparently protects against ants. Touch a tree with the gall of a green lizard. Mm. Decoction of wormwood or house leek was used on turnips to protect them. The skull of a beast of burden put on a stake in the garden, and also hanging up crayfish protected against caterpillars.
I don't
Yep.
know where they get all this from.
I don't know. Sometimes the thing I always find interesting, particularly with ancient Rome, ancient Greece as well. Sometimes they're absolutely on the money. They just don't know why. They don't know
This is
why the
it.
science works behind it, but there's a
Yeah.
scientific. It's I suppose you'd call it old wives' tales, or what we used to say is old wives' tales. Is that there's something that works. You can't go into the science of it because you're not aware of the science.
No,
However, it just works, and then later on, people go, "Oh, actually, that does check out."
it's
Some of
true.
these, I'm pretty sure, probably aren't. I don't know about the decoction of wormwood or house leek. I don't know whether that had any viable things. Apparently, skull of a beast of burden. Someone says they still, in some gardens, they still have stakes with cups in them or something to attract ants. Or
Uh-huh.
again, I don't know if that's something.
Okay. Well,
Possibly, perhaps if they saw ants, if
yeah.
you put a skull, perhaps it wasn't an actual skull, perhaps it was the head with bit of bits on it. Then they saw there were loads of ants on that. They would then assume that those ants aren't anywhere else.
Mm.
Perhaps
Yeah,
that's
well,
where they, yeah.
maybe. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of whether we've not found skulls particular. There are occasionally like remnants of skulls, but I
Mm.
can't think of any. Maybe. Or fruit. Maybe they were using fruit or something. I don't know. But yeah,
That was Pliny talking generally, so it
of
might have been
course.
some, again,
Varies, doesn't it? Yeah.
to be fair, I think he even goes and says that's rubbish. But
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. He's not always everything Pliny writes down isn't always he likes writing
Taking it
things
out
down
is
and then saying at the end of them, but that's rubbish. So in
yeah.
which case it's a bit like Herodotus when he writes, oh, and there were giant, massive Jaffa cakes and they rolled all over the Egyptians and that's how we got Crete. And then at the end of it, it'll go, I don't believe any of that. That's all rubbish.
Yes,
And you're thinking,
yeah,
but you
very
still put
true.
it in there. But you why? But because you want, I don't blame him for that. So it's yeah. I suppose it's just whatever works for you. So that was I just wanted to throw that in there with pests, and thanks for giving me the segue. That was a really good one.
Yeah,
I was
that
going
was
to say,
good.
how can I get that in there?
I know. Well, actually, now you say it, so I went, of course, when I went to Pompeii many times
Hmm,
for my research, and still am, hopefully this year.
fingers
um,
crossed.
yeah, fingers crossed. I went to a local olive yard to speak to some of the locals. And then they took me down to their little lemon grove, and there were all sorts of things going on. They said, well, we only graft under the moonlight. I said, why do you do that? And they said, because it draws the sap out and it's much easier to see. And
Ah,
this is actually referenced in one of the ancient writers. They say do it
Okay.
under the moonlight. And originally I thought, what a random thing to say. There's no talking about this sap as far as I know. So I thought that's just this, you know, like you were saying, is it rubbish? But no, they do it now, and there's a very good reason for it.
I'm always conscious that I generally don't like poo-pooing what people do, because if they're doing it and they're happy, hey, why don't you go out at moonlight and draw some sap? Go for
Oh
it.
yeah,
Have a great time. But at the same time, someone will come along and then just go, well, actually,
yeah,
and then they just roll
right.
over you with a bunch of science, and then you're left. Yeah.
And then
So
you're
so
like,
I
well, of
just
course, it makes so much sense now. But
exactly, exactly. And what's interesting there is you've got a kind of cultural memory going down.
this
Within the
is it.
region, that obviously has changed hugely. For those of you who aren't fully aware about Pompeii, Pompeii is invariably seen as Roman, but for pretty much all of its entirety, it wasn't Roman. It was an
Mhm.
association of different people like Oscans, possibly Etruscans. There's talk of Phoenicians. There's lots of different tribes and societies and peoples who
Yeah.
who lived and acted in Pompeii. And it's only in the I think it's under Sulla when it gets really brought into the Roman Empire proper. But it
Mhm.
wasn't really Roman in many ways. It was Roman because, of course, what they do is they have baths there. They have a lot of the sort of Roman cultural furniture that you expect to have. In other ways, they're not. So sometimes you might think, well, perhaps in that part of southern Italy, which was largely informed through Greek influence, some of these things were just what people did. And like you said, Pompeii didn't start when they had an aqueduct. They'd been accessing water and tapping water for centuries
Yeah.
before Rome decided to give them or provide or build an aqueduct.
Mhm.
So there's
Mhm.
lots of these skills and technologies which I presume would have been learnt and kept. And having something that's referred to, as you say, in a text, and 2000 or so years later, people are still doing it, absolutely proves that there could have been things that people were doing in the 5th century BCE, when you had Athens and Sparta, you also had Pompeii, and people doing things in a particular way they were still doing hundreds of years later to do with how you grow and how you cultivate food.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It is.
You
It's
could go
really
into
interesting.
it forever.
I don't know how I'm going to edit down this episode because there's so much there. I think this might be one you just have to sit down with and just enjoy. Just sit in the garden or sit on the balcony and listen to it.
That's right.
We've looked at a lot of the aspects. I think we've covered most of the things we wanted to cover. Is
Mm.
there anything that you want to say? Anything that we've missed, or you would like to go over again or introduce?
Yeah, so actually, the thing that sticks out for me is I've been looking at commercial gardens and the triclinia, the couches within them. And there are a lot of these, and I've been trying to work out why. And I think, well, we were talking about little apartments earlier, the poorest of the poor. And some of
Yeah.
these actually lead down into these gardens. So this was either the gardener or the owner. Unlikely to be the owner when you've got a big garden.
Yeah.
He's probably in one of the bigger houses. But yes, any one of those, or just renters that might have had access to this garden. They might have been able to use it, garden in it. We don't
Okay.
know. So it's really interesting, and
Ooh.
looking into ownership as well of these gardens is interesting. So the Pompeians would have owned whole insulae. I mean, Cicero talks of that in a nearby town and says he makes loads of money from it, like,
Yeah.
millions, and
Mm.
from his insula. So they seem to have been, especially after the earthquake, building them down because actually they don't want to rebuild because they might keep having earthquakes,
Yeah.
and they did keep having them. There were tremors all the time, and this was a lead up to the eruption. We know that now, but
Mm.
they didn't. Um, but yes, they were sort of renting these. They seem to have been renting gardens out, and within them there are triclinia. I think that the possibility is that people were renting these triclinia to have dinner parties in, and
Okay.
that I don't think that would be unusual for them.
No.
I think that would be quite normal if you didn't have one yourself, or you just wanted a different. I mean, we do it now. We don't always
Yeah.
eat at home. We don't
No.
always
No.
have dinner
Absolutely
parties
not.
at home. We go out and we have dinner for our birthdays or whatever. I feel like this would have been happening there. It's not ever really been gone into. There's one scholar references the idea of renting out triclinia, and that's it. Nobody has ever spoken about it again.
So this is
So
a really new. This is
yeah,
a new perspective that you've been working on. That's absolutely
yeah.
fascinating. I never thought of that, but again, why not?
Why not? Exactly. And they were very, my research has also shown they were very, very visible. So if you're walking down the street and you look left into a garden, for example, you can see the triclinium there. It's almost like an advertisement, I think.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, and they have serving tables there. Some of them are near kitchens, indoors,
Mm.
near processing areas. Some of them have treading floors for wine, and
Yeah.
then in the triclinia or shrines in particular are very, very common in all sorts of gardens to protect them. And Priapus was one of those. He was
Yeah.
looked at as a scarecrow.
Yeah. Yeah. He was
So
quite scary.
yeah, he was. Um, so yeah, I think this commercial dining area is really, really quite a fascinating area. And actually,
Mm.
there's a Calpona, which is a tavern, I suppose, a pub.
Mm.
And you could go there. So there's one called Calpona of Eucinus, and he has an advertisement outside like, "I wish you good luck," and from me, from Eucinus, and he's got Amphorae in his shop that says delivered to Eucinus by the amphitheatre in Pompeii. So he was having stuff delivered to him, and someone had written this on there to make sure it got to him, this specific wine. And he had vines in his garden. And Jashemsky thinks because of the size of it and the fact that it had a door leading straight onto the street outside and onto the shop next door, that it was probably used to serve people in
Okay.
the garden. Yeah, so with temporary fixtures, wooden tables and the like. And we do have
Yeah.
frescoes of those from inns around Pompeii. So yeah, they were being used for very, very different things. And I think, like you were saying earlier, they were really maximizing the use of these spaces. They
Mm.
weren't just growing in them always. They were inviting their friends into them, or they were potentially renting out the triclinia, or they were serving people among the vines and the trees in a nice shaded environment by the amphitheatre. So
I wonder if it was we spoke earlier about the patron client relationship that was
mhm,
sort of a standard thing. I wonder perhaps as well that could have been part of it. In that, if you were a client, then you could access,
yeah,
if your patron had a garden, that might be
exactly.
part of being, that relationship could be, well, this is one of the benefits you get if you're one of my clients, is that
Mhm.
occasionally I'll let you come and use the triclinium in my garden. You can use
Very,
that
very
for
possible.
it's that kind of thing. It does open up a load of possibilities.
It does. It does. So interesting. And yeah,
Mm.
they're not they're never one-dimensional spaces, these gardens.
No.
There's so many crossovers, like with the House of the Ephebe we said about earlier. There are a lot of crossovers, but more often the commercial side does seem to have entertaining areas of some sort. I mean, the Shop House Garden, again, has a little apartment above, and it's not a massive space, but it was created by demolishing a house on it that had been potentially destroyed in the earthquake again. They'd added a cistern, they put in some vines, and at the back of the garden there's this little area with lots of paraphernalia from everyday life, including toys of children.
Okay, so
Hairpin,
the kids
yeah, all
area.
sorts. Oh yeah, like hairpins. They had a little stove to cook over. They were dedicating things there. They had pots and pans and things to eat out of. They had all sorts, and they were clearly using this as an extra living room, almost like
Right.
you'd have a barbecue, and you'd
Yeah,
all go
yeah.
and sit around and all these little items. Yeah, the hairpin was found on the path, I think.
I'm going to need to get you on another episode, I
Mm.
think, just to talk about this, because I wasn't aware of this, and I'm finding it very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's just, I'm trying to now think. I'm going to spend the next few days thinking on this in terms of what could they have done? Local dignitaries come in. Yeah, wouldn't it be great if a
Mm,
local dignitary comes along and you say, well, guess what? You can eat in my triclinium, or my patrons
yeah,
triclinium. All of these kind of things, it opens up an entire different sort of social dimension to everything. So yeah,
it
no,
does.
I'd really be very interested when you are able
Yeah.
to bring more.
Absolutely. Oh, and there's probably one more thing to mention, and this is one
Okay.
of my favourites. It is the broken amphorae,
Oh yeah.
the terracottas in the top of the walls, and they were trying
Yes.
to keep what Shashemsky says the kids out from stealing the fruit, which I think is
Right.
brilliant. So they literally were trying to, and they still do this today. So I went past an orchard near my house that had glass on the top of the wall. I don't know if it's to stop birds or what have you, but it's still done. And dogs in particular were very, very important in gardens.
Yeah.
Jasensky said she'd never excavated a garden that didn't have some evidence of a dog in it, of bones, dog bones.
Do you think the dogs had lived in the gardens? They would have had some sort of kennel doghouse thing.
Yes, they had dog houses, so they broke up Amphorae or Dahlia, and they make little kennels for them. It's ever
So,
so sweet. It's ever so
Amphorae
sweet.
kennels.
Yeah, and there was one with a bone nearby.
Oh,
It's incredible. It's like from Dennis the Menace. Yeah, it's lovely. And there was one garden that had a big dog and a little dog, a little lap dog. So they
oh
were looking
yeah,
after the garden.
yeah. The lap dogs were a real kind of prestige thing. They were kind of Pomerian type
Yes, they
species that
were.
they used to have. They
Exactly.
feature, I think, on Greek vases. The Greeks really,
Mhm.
really enjoyed them as well. It was one of those things that people have, and again, they have them today. I saw that there was a tortoise shell found in one of the
Mm,
gardens.
they were,
So I
yeah.
don't know if that was a pet tortoise. I presume it must have been.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think so. I don't think they would have eaten it, but they did have a lot
No.
of they did have a lot of bones. That like the cattle market we were talking about earlier. They thought that that was a cattle market because there were so many animal bones found there. They
Okay.
had like goat and pig and cow and sheep. It's hard to tell
And
between
it
sheep and
wasn't.
goat.
So they've revised that, have they? They've worked out that it wasn't a cow market and that
Yeah,
it was
but
actually a vineyard. Or
exactly. Yes,
yeah.
that's the one that
Okay.
may have had 4,000 vines in it.
Wow. All that wine.
Yeah. I know. They have fully excavated it now, and it is around that. It is around that amount with the trees that you mentioned, the 58 trees. And to be honest, like nobody's looked into this, but whether they kept chickens and all sorts in their
Mm,
gardens, again,
yeah.
likely. I don't think you'd want to keep a goat in your garden. I think it
No.
would run riot. But maybe pigs. That's that still goes on
Possibly.
today, and
Yeah.
they're not so
Yeah.
much of a burden that we think they would. I mean, Pompeii was a smelly place anyway. I don't
Mm,
think pigs would smell particularly badly next to somewhere where you were washing your clothes with urine
yeah.
in a Phalonica. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Possible.
I read again that they used, just to go on the smells thing, why not?
Mm,
They used human excrement as the dung and fertilizer
fertilizer.
in
Yeah.
Rome. Do we know if they did that in Pompeii?
So I don't know about human, but they did bring in fertilizer. So
Right.
we've got evidence of soil that doesn't come from Pompeii. So they're
Okay.
bringing it in, and there are piles of it in some gardens where they're ready to use it.
Oh, okay. So
And
it was that they had that. They had almost what's his name? What do you call it in the corner of the garden? It's like refuse.
like a little
Yeah,
compost pot.
compost. That's it. Yeah. So they had
Yes.
their own ready-made compost.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, they would have been doing all that, and, little pits where they'd be burning stuff, and, yeah, so they were bringing in all sorts. It's quite interesting to see where they're coming from, where
Hmm.
they're bringing all of these things from, and I imagine that's something to do with which plants were brought in as well. You could, with the soil, you could work that out. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I
interesting.
imagine that. Yeah. Bearing in mind what you said about the beans.
Mhm.
And I think that's it. I just want to say thanks again for coming on and talking as well as you have done in depth about so many different things.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I'd do it any time. Always happy to talk about gardens.
Well, yeah. Again, perhaps we can do something more when you've looked into that particular area that you spoke about earlier. If you've listened to this and you've kept all the way through, really appreciate that. I hope you found it as interesting to listen to as it has been to record and talk to Jessica about. And Jessica, is there any final thoughts? Anything you want to say more?
No, just gonna go out in the sun now, into the
Yep.
garden. Yeah,
There we go. Yeah, I'm going to go for a walk now. I'm going to go and get a coffee and
definitely.
have a walk and do some thinking. I'm going to see if I can see any sort of crayfish hanging around the place in any of the gardens in
Oh god,
Brighton. Probably not.
hopefully not.
Although it could be a thing. You never know, Brighton. Until next time, as ever, keep safe and take care. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.